Would you still offer your last meal to a stranger if that single act could change the rest of your life forever? The rain fell hard across a quiet street in downtown Chicago, turning cracked sidewalks into shallow mirrors that reflected flashing traffic lights and the grey evening sky. Amelia Brooks adjusted the worn sleeves of her faded burgundy cardigan as she locked the door of the tiny flower shop where she worked 6 days a week. At 29 years old, Amelia had learned to smile through embarrassment. Customers often overlooked her because of her curvy figure, while others whispered cruel comments they assumed she could not hear. Her paycheck barely covered the rent for her small apartment on the South Side, leaving little room for anything beyond groceries, bus fare, and helping her elderly grandmother whenever medical bills appeared. Still, every morning she arranged roses, lilies, and wildflowers as though each bouquet carried hope for someone else's tomorrow. That evening, her stomach ached with hunger because she had skipped lunch to save money. Inside her canvas bag rested the only food she had left until payday, a simple turkey sandwich she had wrapped before leaving home. As she hurried toward the bus stop, thunder echoed overhead, forcing pedestrians to seek shelter beneath storefront awnings. Amelia noticed a man sitting alone against an old brick building, completely soaked by the relentless rain. His black suit was expensive despite being drenched, his tie hung loosely around his neck, and a fresh cut marked the side of his face. Dark hair clung to his forehead while one hand pressed firmly against his ribs, as though hiding an injury. Most people passed without slowing down. A few glanced at him before looking away. Someone muttered that he was probably drunk. Another suggested calling the police, but continued walking without doing so. Amelia stopped. Something about the stranger's exhausted eyes did not match the expensive clothes he wore. They carried pain instead of arrogance, loneliness instead of anger. She quietly stepped closer and knelt beside him, careful not to invade his space. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. The man lifted his head just enough to study her face. His expression remained guarded, almost suspicious, yet there was no hostility in his voice when he answered, "I've been better." His deep tone sounded controlled, despite obvious fatigue. Amelia hesitated before opening her bag. She looked down at the sandwich, knowing it represented her dinner and tomorrow's breakfast if she stretched it carefully. Her stomach reminded her exactly how hungry she was. For a brief moment, common sense urged her to keep walking. She did not know this man. She owed him nothing. Yet another part of her remembered every difficult day when she had wished just one stranger would show her kindness without expecting anything in return. She gently held the sandwich toward him. "You probably need this more than I do." The man stared at the sandwich without moving. Then he looked back at her, almost confused by the offer. "You don't even know me," he said quietly. Amelia managed a small smile. "No, but I know what it looks like when someone hasn't been shown much kindness today." He accepted the sandwich slowly, as though it weighed far more than bread and turkey. Before taking a bite, he watched her carefully, searching for signs of pity, hidden motives, or fear. He found none. She simply sat beside him beneath the rain-soaked awning, sharing the silence while water streamed down the street. Neither of them noticed the black SUV parked half a block away. Inside, several heavily armed men watched through tinted windows with growing disbelief. Their tense expressions shifted from alarm to absolute shock as they recognized the injured stranger. One bodyguard reached for his radio with trembling hands. "We've finally found Mr. DeLuca," he whispered, "and he's sitting beside a florist who has no idea she's sharing her last sandwich with the most feared Mafia boss in America." Amelia followed the direction of the man's gaze just as 3 black SUVs rolled silently to the curb, their headlights cutting through the curtain of rain like pale blades. The rear doors opened almost at once, and half a dozen men in dark suits stepped onto the sidewalk with disciplined precision. Their movements were calm but urgent, scanning every rooftop, every parked vehicle, every shadow across the street. Pedestrians immediately changed direction, sensing something dangerous without understanding why. Amelia instinctively shifted backward, wondering if she had stumbled into trouble. The injured stranger remained seated against the brick wall, showing no surprise at the arrival of the convoy. Instead, his tired eyes settled on the approaching men with quiet disappointment, as though he had hoped they would never find him. The oldest of the bodyguards stopped several feet away before lowering his head respectfully. "Boss," he said, his voice carrying both relief and guilt. "We've secured the perimeter." Amelia blinked in confusion. "Boss?" Before she could ask what he meant, every man on the sidewalk straightened at once, waiting for a single instruction from the wounded stranger. He slowly stood despite obvious pain, refusing the hands reaching toward him. Even injured, his posture changed completely. The exhausted man she had met moments earlier disappeared, replaced by someone whose presence alone silenced an entire street. His shoulders squared. His expression became unreadable. His voice, though quiet, carried effortless authority. "Report." The older bodyguard swallowed. "The attack came from inside the warehouse, exactly as you suspected. 2 security teams were compromised. We eliminated the immediate threat, but the traitor escaped before we arrived. We searched every hospital in the city after losing your signal." The stranger nodded once. "Casualties?" 4 loyal men injured. 1 didn't survive. A shadow crossed his face for only a heartbeat before it disappeared beneath absolute control. Amelia listened without understanding the full conversation, but one thing became painfully clear. This was no ordinary businessman. Every person around him obeyed instantly. Every passing driver slowed down before quickly moving on. Even the police cruiser turning the corner continued past without stopping. The stranger finally turned toward Amelia. His dark eyes softened just enough to remind her of the man who had accepted half of her sandwich only minutes before. "Thank you," he said simply. "You should go home." Amelia hesitated. "Your injury needs a doctor." Several bodyguards exchanged surprised glances. None of them could remember the last time someone had spoken to their employer so naturally. No fear, no flattery, no hidden agenda, just genuine concern. One younger guard quietly leaned toward another and whispered, "She has no idea who he's talking to." The older guard answered without taking his eyes off Amelia. Maybe that's exactly why he's still speaking to her. The stranger looked down at the unfinished sandwich still resting in his hand. A faint smile almost appeared before fading again. "What's your name?" "Amelia Brooks." "You own the flower shop?" She nodded. "I work there. Someday I'd like to own one." He seemed to remember those words rather than merely hear them. "And you?" she asked before thinking better of it. Several bodyguards stiffened immediately. Nobody asked him personal questions, ever. Instead of taking offense, he answered after a brief pause. "Luca DeLuca." The name meant nothing to Amelia. She simply smiled politely. "Well, Mr. DeLuca, you should let someone stitch that cut before it gets worse." For the first time that evening, a few bodyguards looked genuinely amused. Across Chicago, politicians, CEOs, and violent criminals spoke the name Luca DeLuca with caution. Newspapers rarely printed it. Law enforcement built entire task forces around tracking his organization, and rival syndicates blamed him for dismantling criminal empires across multiple states. Yet this florist was calmly giving him medical advice as if he were an exhausted customer buying roses after work. Luca studied her face for another moment. There was no recognition, no calculation. She truly did not know who stood before her. Somehow he found that refreshing. Before he could say another word, a black SUV accelerated through the intersection far faster than the rain-slick streets allowed. One of Luca's security men immediately shouted, "Incoming!" Another reached beneath his jacket, while 2 others rushed toward Amelia without explanation. Tires screamed against wet pavement as the speeding vehicle veered directly toward the sidewalk instead of the road ahead. Luca's expression hardened instantly. This was no accident. Someone had found him before his security team could move him. Without hesitation, he stepped between the speeding SUV and the woman who had shared her last meal with a stranger, realizing too late that the attempt on his life had just placed Amelia Brooks in the crosshairs of enemies who would eliminate anyone standing too close to America's most feared mafia boss. The black SUV jumped the curb with terrifying speed, spraying water across the sidewalk as pedestrians screamed and scattered in every direction. Luca reacted before anyone else. He grabbed Amelia around the shoulders and drove both of them behind a concrete planter just as the vehicle slammed into a newspaper stand, sending twisted metal and shattered glass flying through the rain. One of Luca's bodyguards fired several controlled shots into the engine block, forcing the SUV to stall before it could reverse. The doors burst open and 3 armed men rushed out, their faces hidden beneath dark hoods. They ignored everyone else. Their eyes locked immediately on Luca. "Take the boss alive!" one of them shouted. Amelia's heart pounded so violently she could barely breathe. Only minutes earlier she had been thinking about catching the evening bus home. Now bullets cracked through the rain above her head while strangers risked their lives protecting the wounded man beside her. Luca remained astonishingly calm despite the chaos. He glanced toward Amelia, lowering his voice. "Stay down. Don't move unless one of my men tells you." She wanted to ask what was happening, but another burst of gunfire shattered the brick wall only feet away. The bodyguards formed a protective circle around Luca while returning fire with remarkable discipline, directing terrified civilians toward nearby buildings instead of allowing panic to spread across the street. Their priority was clear. Protect innocent people first. Protect their boss second. One attacker attempted to rush through the defensive line, only to be tackled by a security officer before reaching Luca. The struggle lasted seconds before the gunman was disarmed and restrained. Another attacker escaped into a narrow alley as police sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Whoever had planned the ambush understood they had only a small window before law enforcement arrived. Luca watched the retreating vehicle disappear around the corner, his expression growing colder with every passing second. "They knew exactly where to find me," he said quietly. "Someone is still feeding them information." The older bodyguard nodded grimly. "We'll identify the leak, boss." Before Luca could respond, Amelia noticed something everyone else had missed. A 4th man had never left the disabled SUV. Instead, he had quietly crawled behind the wreckage, raising a compact handgun toward Luca while the others created a distraction. Without thinking, Amelia shouted, "Behind the car!" Her warning came less than a second before the gunman pulled the trigger. Luca turned instinctively. The bullet struck his shoulder instead of his chest, knocking him backward. 2 bodyguards immediately neutralized the attacker before he could fire again. The street finally fell silent, except for rain and distant sirens. Luca pressed one hand against the fresh wound but kept his eyes fixed on Amelia. She had saved his life. Again. One bodyguard stared at her with open disbelief. If she hadn't seen him. He never finished the sentence. Everyone understood the rest. Emergency vehicles approached from several blocks away. The older bodyguard spoke quickly. "Boss, we have to leave before every news camera in Chicago gets here." Luca remained motionless for another moment. His gaze shifted toward Amelia, who still looked shaken, her cardigan spotted with rain and dust from the explosion. She had every reason to run as far away as possible. Instead, she took a cautious step closer. "You're bleeding again," she whispered. "Please let someone help you." Her concern carried no expectation of reward. It wasn't admiration for power because she still did not fully understand who he was. It was simply compassion. Luca had spent most of his adult life surrounded by people motivated by fear, money, or ambition. Genuine kindness had become so rare that he almost no longer recognized it. "Amelia," he said, his voice unusually gentle, "you've already done more than enough." She shook her head. No one should be left hurt in the rain. Those simple words lingered in the silence between them. The older bodyguard suddenly received an urgent message through his earpiece. His expression changed immediately. "Boss, we've intercepted communications. The rival crew has your photo circulating across every channel." He hesitated before adding the next sentence. "They also have hers." Amelia frowned. "Mine?" The bodyguard looked directly at Luca. "They believe she witnessed the attack. They think she can identify one of their people." Luca understood the truth instantly. It did not matter whether Amelia had actually recognized anyone. From this moment forward, the rival organization would assume she was a liability. People willing to assassinate him in broad daylight would never hesitate to silence an innocent florist. Amelia noticed the hardened look returning to Luca's face. "What's wrong?" she asked quietly. He answered without looking away from her. "You went home safely an hour ago." She blinked in confusion. What? That's the story my people will tell anyone who asks. His tone left no room for argument. Because if my enemies discover you helped me tonight, they won't stop until they find you. Amelia felt the weight of his words settle over her like the cold rain. The stranger who had accepted half of her last sandwich was no longer just an injured man. His dangerous world had reached out and touched hers. Amelia stared through the rain-streaked window of the armored SUV as downtown Chicago disappeared behind them, its glowing skyline fading into a blur of flashing lights and wet pavement. Everything had happened too quickly. Less than an hour earlier, she had been closing a neighborhood flower shop, worrying about rent and wondering how to stretch the last few dollars in her checking account until payday. Now she sat inside a convoy surrounded by heavily trained security personnel who treated every intersection as a potential battlefield. Across from her, Luca DeLuca remained silent while a medic cleaned the gunshot wound that had grazed his shoulder. He never flinched. His attention stayed fixed on a tablet displaying security reports, surveillance images, and encrypted messages arriving every few seconds. Amelia finally broke the silence. You said your enemies would come after me. Is that really necessary? They don't even know who I am. Luca looked up, his expression calm but firm. They don't need to know you. They only need to believe you matter to me. Those words settled heavily inside the vehicle. Amelia lowered her eyes, unsure how to respond. They had known each other for less than an hour. Yet she could already sense that people died because of assumptions made in Luca's world. The convoy turned through a set of massive iron gates guarded by armed security before entering a secluded estate hidden behind old oak trees on the outskirts of the city. The mansion was elegant rather than extravagant, built from stone with warm lights glowing behind tall windows. It looked more like a historic family estate than the headquarters of one of America's most feared criminal organizations. As Amelia stepped inside, she expected intimidation. Instead, she found quiet professionalism. Staff members greeted Luca respectfully before immediately noticing the blood soaking through his jacket. Within moments, a physician arrived, security officers dispersed to their assigned positions, and the household shifted into a practiced routine. No one stared at Amelia. No one asked unnecessary questions. She was escorted into a comfortable sitting room where dry clothes and a warm cup of tea had already been prepared. A housekeeper smiled kindly. Mr. DeLuca asked us to make sure you're comfortable. Amelia blinked in surprise. He thought about that? He notices more than people realize, the woman replied before quietly leaving the room. Nearly an hour later, Luca entered wearing a fresh charcoal suit, the wound beneath his shoulder neatly bandaged. He looked composed again, almost untouchable, but Amelia noticed one small detail that revealed the truth. His movements were slightly slower than before, carefully hiding the pain he refused to acknowledge. He sat across from her without the army of bodyguards that usually surrounded him. I'm sorry your life became complicated because of me, he said. Amelia studied him for a long moment before answering. Were you really apologizing? A faint smile crossed his face. Not something I do often. I can tell. For the first time that evening, the tension eased between them. Before either could continue, the older bodyguard entered carrying a sealed folder. Boss, we've identified the abandoned SUV. Luca opened the file, his expression hardening as he reviewed several photographs. One image immediately caught Amelia's attention. It showed the driver's face moments before the attack. Her eyes widened. I've seen him before. Every person in the room looked toward her. Luca slowly lowered the folder. Where? Amelia leaned closer to the photograph. He came into the flower shop about 2 weeks ago. He didn't buy anything. He kept asking strange questions about delivery schedules and who owned the building next door. The older bodyguard frowned. Why would one of Romano's men be watching a florist? Amelia thought carefully. I remember because he argued with someone outside after he left. They mentioned an old warehouse across the street. Luca immediately stood. The warehouse where I was attacked. The realization spread through the room almost instantly. This had never been about Amelia personally. Her flower shop had unknowingly sat across from one of the properties secretly used by Luca's organization. The attackers had been conducting surveillance there for weeks, blending into ordinary foot traffic. Amelia had simply remembered details no trained investigator had connected. She had become dangerous because she possessed a piece of the truth without realizing it. The older bodyguard spoke quietly. "Boss, if Romano discovers she recognized one of his surveillance men, she'll become his highest priority." Luca walked toward the window overlooking the rain-covered grounds, his jaw tightening. He had spent years keeping innocent people outside his violent world. Now fate had placed the kindest woman he had met in years directly in the path of a ruthless rival. Amelia slowly approached him. "If I'm the reason they're looking, I'll leave. Maybe they'll stop once they realize I'm gone." Luca turned immediately. "No." His answer came so quickly that even he seemed surprised by its certainty. "Running alone would make you easier to find." "Then what am I supposed to do?" she asked softly. He held her gaze for several seconds before speaking with quiet conviction. "From this moment forward, no one touches you without going through me first." Every conversation inside the mansion stopped the moment the surveillance feed appeared on the large security monitor. The smiling man holding the bouquet looked harmless enough to fool anyone who saw him for only a few seconds. He wore a tailored navy blazer, carried himself with relaxed confidence, and thanked the young cashier with perfect manners while asking where Amelia Brooks lived. Luca recognized the face immediately. "Marco Bellini," he said quietly. "One of Romano's most trusted enforcers." Amelia looked from the screen to Luca. "He doesn't look dangerous." "That's why he's effective," Luca replied. "The most dangerous people rarely do." The older bodyguard enlarged the camera image as Bellini casually left the flower shop after receiving no useful information. Another security feed showed him speaking into an earpiece before disappearing into a waiting sedan parked across the street. "They've confirmed she's connected to us," the bodyguard reported. "The surveillance teams will expand before sunrise." Luca did not hesitate. "Move every employee from the flower shop into protective custody until we determine who's being watched. Pay their salaries in full while they're away." Amelia turned toward him in surprise. "You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do." His answer was calm but absolute. Romano attacks innocent people when he can't reach his real target. Amelia felt a knot tighten in her chest. She had spent years building friendships with the small staff at the shop. The thought that they could be endangered because of her was almost unbearable. "This is my fault," she whispered. Luca looked directly at her. "No, this is the fault of men who choose violence over humanity." Before Amelia could answer, another security officer entered the room carrying a tablet. "Boss, we've traced Bellini's vehicle. It's heading toward Navy Pier." Luca studied the live satellite images for several seconds before his expression changed. "He's not searching anymore." "What do you mean?" asked the older bodyguard. Luca zoomed in on another location. "He's setting a trap." Every person in the room understood exactly what that meant. Romano knew Luca would never ignore a direct threat against someone under his protection. The enemy was counting on Luca to respond emotionally instead of strategically. Amelia noticed the tension spreading through the command room. "You're going after him." Luca nodded once. "If I don't stop this tonight, they'll keep hunting you tomorrow." She stepped closer. "Then I'm coming too." Every bodyguard looked at her in disbelief. Luca almost smiled despite the seriousness of the situation. "Absolutely not. They're looking for me. Maybe I can help identify someone else. You already helped enough. And what if more innocent people get hurt because I'm hiding here?" Luca remained silent for a moment. He admired her courage, but courage without protection became recklessness. Before he could refuse again, the oldest bodyguard quietly interrupted. "Boss, she's right about one thing." Luca turned toward him. "Explain." "Romano believes Miss Brooks is frightened and confused. He won't expect her to stay close to us. If we control the environment, her presence could expose whoever is coordinating surveillance from inside the crowd." The room fell quiet. It was dangerous. It was risky. But it also made tactical sense. Luca looked back at Amelia. "If you leave this estate, you follow every instruction I give without hesitation." She nodded immediately. "I promise." Less than an hour later, the convoy reached Navy Pier under the cover of darkness. Families and tourists had mostly gone home because of the storm, leaving only scattered visitors beneath the glowing lights reflecting across Lake Michigan. Amelia remained inside an armoured SUV while discreet security teams blended into the surroundings. Luca walked several yards ahead, appearing almost alone despite dozens of hidden operatives watching every angle. Bellini emerged exactly as expected, still carrying the bouquet of white lilies. He smiled politely when he saw Luca. "You came personally." Luca's voice was steady. "You were looking for someone who belongs under my protection." Bellini chuckled. "Protection? Interesting choice of words for a man with your reputation." Their conversation lasted only seconds before Bellini raised one hand. At least 8 armed men stepped from behind parked vehicles, maintenance buildings and empty vendor kiosks. Weapons appeared almost simultaneously. Amelia watched through the SUV window as her heartbeat accelerated. Luca remained perfectly still. Instead of reaching for a weapon, he simply glanced toward the surrounding rooftops. Now! Powerful floodlights exploded across the pier, instantly exposing every hidden attacker. At the same moment, Luca's security teams emerged from every direction, surrounding Romano's men with overwhelming precision. Bellini's confident smile vanished. He slowly realized he had walked into Luca's countertrap instead of the other way around. "Tell Romano," Luca said, his voice carrying across the silent pier, "that he made one unforgivable mistake." Bellini narrowed his eyes. "And what's that?" Luca took one deliberate step forward. He believed kindness was weakness. Just then, a sharp crack echoed from somewhere above. Every trained guard instinctively looked toward the rooftops, but Amelia's eyes caught movement in a different direction. Hidden beneath the maintenance dock, a lone sniper had ignored Luca completely. The rifle was aimed directly at him, and the trigger was already beginning to move. Amelia's voice broke through the chaos before anyone else realized what she had seen. "Luca, down!" she shouted with every ounce of strength she had. Without questioning the warning, Luca dropped sideways just as the hidden sniper fired. The bullet sliced through the air where his head had been only a fraction of a second earlier, before striking a steel railing behind him. In the same instant, Luca's counter-sniper team identified the muzzle flash beneath the maintenance dock and neutralized the threat before a second shot could be fired. Bellini's remaining men froze as they suddenly understood they had lost every tactical advantage. Within seconds, Luca's security team had disarmed the attackers without further bloodshed, securing the entire pier, while local law enforcement received anonymous tips directing them toward the captured gunmen. Bellini lowered his weapon slowly, his confidence completely gone. "Romano underestimated you," he admitted. Luca looked at him with the same calm expression Amelia had first seen beneath the rain. "No," he replied quietly. "He underestimated her." Bellini followed Luca's gaze toward Amelia, who had stepped out of the armoured SUV despite repeated instructions to stay inside. She was trembling, not because she regretted helping, but because she had finally understood how close death had come to the man whose life had crossed hers through a single act of kindness. As the last of the attackers were taken away, the older bodyguard approached Luca carrying a recovered phone taken from Bellini. "Boss, our analysts unlocked it." He handed over the device. Messages, payment records, and encrypted conversations filled the screen. At the center of nearly every exchange was one name. Romano had orchestrated the warehouse betrayal, the assassination attempt, and the surveillance operation that had placed Amelia in danger. More importantly, the records contained financial evidence linking Romano to multiple violent crimes that authorities had been unable to prove for years. Luca closed the phone and handed it back. "Send copies anonymously to the Federal Task Force." The older bodyguard nodded once. "Understood." Amelia looked surprised. "You're giving it to the authorities?" Luca met her eyes. Justice doesn't always require revenge. It was the first time she had seen the feared Mafia Boss choose restraint when vengeance would have been easier. Over the following weeks, Romano's organization collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. Former allies abandoned him. Hidden accounts were frozen. Several key members accepted plea agreements, and the empire that had spread fear across the region quietly fell apart without another public battle. As peace slowly returned, Amelia expected her own life to return to normal as well. Instead, one sunny Saturday morning, Luca arrived at the flower shop wearing a simple navy jacket instead of an expensive suit. There were no convoys blocking the street, no visible bodyguards crowding the sidewalk, only one discreet vehicle parked a respectful distance away. Customers continued browsing flowers without realizing who had just walked through the door. Amelia smiled warmly. "Looking for flowers today?" Luca glanced around the little shop before answering. "Actually, I'm looking for the owner." She laughed softly. "You have the wrong person." He slid a folder across the counter. Confused, Amelia opened it. Inside were legal documents transferring ownership of the flower shop into her name. She stared at the pages in disbelief. "Luca, I can't accept this." "You can," he answered gently. "It's not charity." She looked up, still speechless. "Then what is it?" "An investment in someone who reminded me that kindness still exists." Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. Luca noticed immediately. Instead of speaking, he removed his jacket and carefully placed it around her shoulders, exactly as he had wanted to do on that cold, rainy night, but never had the chance. "You never had to earn the right to be respected," he said softly. "The world simply failed to see your worth." Amelia reached for his hand, no longer embarrassed by who she was or how others had once judged her. Months later, the flower shop became one of the neighborhood's busiest small businesses, known not only for beautiful arrangements, but also for quietly delivering free bouquets to veterans, children's hospitals, and families facing difficult times. Luca visited often, never announcing himself, always leaving with fresh flowers that somehow became an excuse to spend another afternoon beside the woman who had changed his life with half of a sandwich. Their story never began with wealth, power, or fear. It began with compassion freely given when there was nothing to gain. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness reaches the heart that needs it most, and sometimes it changes two lives forever. If you had been in Amelia's place that rainy evening, would you have shared your last sandwich with a stranger? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about courage, hope, and unexpected love, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next unforgettable journey.